Hi, I'm Alex, and I watched a billionaire and his world-renowned expert laugh at my 10-year-old brother when he claimed he could fix a priceless heirloom they had just declared broken forever. They saw a poor kid in a worn-out sweater, a ghost in their luxurious penthouse. They had no idea their entire legacy was resting in his small, grease-stained hands. It's funny how the biggest minds can have the smallest vision. Have you ever felt completely invisible, even when you knew you held the answer? Before I tell you how my brother used a simple pin to silence a room full of millionaires, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and make sure to subscribe. Trust me, you won't want to miss the look on that expert's face when the watch started ticking again. The event was held in Mr. Alistair Finch's penthouse, a place that felt more like a sterile museum than a home. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls overlooked the city, but inside, the air was thick with a different kind of cold. It was the cold of failure. Dozens of wealthy collectors dressed in tailored suits and shimmering dresses moved like sharks in a tank, their whispers echoing in the suffocating silence. My grandfather, the building's maintenance supervisor for 40 years, had been asked to be on standby, and he'd brought me and my little brother Leo along, telling us to stay invisible. But it was impossible not to feel the tension radiating from Mr. Finch himself, a man who looked like his soul had just been auctioned off to the lowest bidder. We were just background noise in his very public nightmare. The source of all this misery was resting on a velvet cushion under a spotlight, the Finch constellation. It wasn't just a pocket watch, it was a legend. Our own grandfather, a clockmaker before he came to this country, used to talk about it with a kind of religious reverence. He said it was a mechanical universe you could hold in your hand, with hundreds of tiny gears moving in perfect sync with the planets. But now it was dead. The intricate hands were frozen, the celestial maps were static, and its silence was deafening. The man hired to fix it, a master horologist from Geneva named Herr Vogel, had just delivered his verdict, and it felt like a death sentence for the beautiful object and for Mr. Finch's spirit. Herr Vogel was the epitome of arrogance. He had arrived with cases of gleaming, high-tech diagnostic tools, treating the watch like a patient on an operating table. He spent hours peering through digital microscopes and running scans, all while making condescending remarks about the antiquated craftsmanship. Finally, with a dramatic sigh, he announced to the hushed room that the mainspring had suffered a catastrophic and irreparable failure. He declared it would need to be shipped to his lab in Switzerland for a year-long, 7-figure repair, and even then he offered no guarantees. He packed his tools with a smug finality, as if he enjoyed being the bearer of such devastating, expensive news. Mr. Finch just slumped in his chair, a broken man surrounded by the vultures he called his peers. Leo had been watching from a dark corner behind a marble pillar, his eyes never leaving the watch. He wasn't looking at the diamonds or the gold casing. He was just listening. While Herr Vogel was making his grand pronouncements, Leo was completely still, his head tilted slightly. Then, as the expert walked away, and a wave of disappointed murmurs filled the room, Leo turned to me and whispered so quietly I almost didn't hear him. "He's wrong." I looked at him, confused. He leaned in closer, his eyes wide and serious. "The heart is still beating," he said, his voice barely audible. "But it's choking." Our grandfather overheard him, and his face went pale with terror, immediately grabbing Leo's arm to pull him back, hissing at him to be quiet. But in that cavern of wealth and despair, a child's whisper traveled farther than a shout. Mr. Finch, who had been staring blankly at his dead heirloom, lifted his head. His eyes, red-rimmed and hollow, scanned the room until they landed on us. He hadn't noticed us all night, but now his gaze was sharp, and not in a good way. "What?" he said, his voice raspy with defeat and irritation. "What did the boy say?" Every head in the room turned toward us. The quiet murmuring stopped. Suddenly, we were the center of attention, and I could feel my grandfather's hand trembling as he held on to Leo. Herr Vogel, who was about to leave, stopped and turned, a contemptuous smirk already forming on his lips, amused by the interruption. My grandfather's hand clamped down on Leo's shoulder like a vice. His face, already etched with the lines of a long, hard life, was now a mask of pure terror. He started stammering, trying to pull us back into the shadows, into the invisibility we were supposed to maintain. "Mr. Finch, sir, I am so sorry. He's just a boy. He doesn't know what he's saying. He has a wild imagination, that's all. Please forgive him." Every word was a desperate plea to make us disappear, to rewind time by 30 seconds. He was bowing slightly, a gesture of subservience that made my stomach churn. He was trying to protect Leo, but in doing so, he was reinforcing the very power structure that was crushing us, making us seem even smaller and more insignificant in that vast, cold room. Herr Vogel let out a short, derisive laugh that cut through the silence. He turned back from the doorway, walking slowly toward Mr. Finch with an air of theatrical pity. "My dear Alistair," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "surely you are not going to entertain the fantasies of a child." He gestured vaguely in our direction without even looking at us. "I have just completed a 6-hour diagnostic, using equipment calibrated to the micron. The metallurgy of the mainspring is compromised. This is a matter of complex physics and material science, not something that can be understood by listening for a heartbeat." He smiled at the other guests, sharing a private joke with his peers at our expense. He was cementing his authority by crushing a 10-year-old's curiosity. The guests, taking their cue from the expert, began to whisper and chuckle amongst themselves. The tension of the failed unveiling had broken, replaced by a new, crueler form of entertainment. We were the court jesters, a bizarre distraction. I saw a woman in a diamond necklace cover her mouth to hide a smirk as she whispered to the man beside her. They weren't just looking at us, they were looking through us, at the amusing spectacle of poverty and ignorance trying to speak in a temple of wealth and knowledge. My fists were clenched so tightly in my pockets that my fingernails were digging into my palms. I've never felt a rage so cold and so helpless. I wanted to scream at them, to tell them they knew nothing about my brother, but I was frozen, just like the watch. But Mr. Finch wasn't. Laughing. His face was a grey, emotionless slate. He raised a hand and my grandfather's frantic apologies died in his throat. He ignored Herr Vogel completely. His hollow eyes were fixed solely on Leo, who stood his ground, unblinking, despite our grandfather's trembling grip on his shoulder. There was no kindness in Mr. Finch's gaze, only a profound, exhausted emptiness. He was a man at the bottom of a pit, and he was looking at Leo not as a savior, but as just another rock to stare at. "I heard what your grandfather said," he stated, his voice a low rasp, "but I want to hear it from you. What did you say?" The question was a demand, sharp and heavy, and it silenced the entire room once more. Leo took a small step forward, gently shrugging off our grandfather's hand. He didn't seem to notice the dozens of judgmental eyes on him, or the world-famous expert staring him down. His world had shrunk to 2 people, himself and the broken man in the chair. He looked directly at Mr. Finch, and spoke, his voice quiet but carrying with an unnerving clarity in the dead silence. "I said he's wrong," Leo stated, nodding slightly toward Herr Vogel. "The watch isn't broken. The heart is still beating." He paused, and I could see him listening to something none of us could hear. "It's just stuck. Something is holding it back, making it choke. It wants to move, but it can't." It was the simplest diagnosis, a world away from Vogel's technical jargon, and it hung in the air with impossible. Wait. An unbearable silence followed. It stretched for what felt like an eternity. Every person in that room was waiting for Mr. Finch to laugh, to call security, to have us thrown out for our audacity. Herr Vogel had his arms crossed, a smug, confident sneer on his face, certain of his impending victory. My grandfather looked like he might actually collapse from the stress, but Mr. Finch just sat there, his gaze shifting from Leo's impossibly serious face to the dead watch on its velvet pillow, and then to the arrogant expert he had paid a fortune to. You could see a war happening behind his eyes, a war between logic and a sliver of something else. Desperation, insanity, a final hopeless roll of the dice when he had already lost everything. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement that seemed to take all of his remaining energy, Mr. Finch lifted his arm and pointed a single, trembling finger toward the display table. The gesture silenced every whisper, every thought. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, but it boomed across the penthouse like a gunshot. "Show me." It wasn't a request. It was a challenge, an order born of utter despair. "Show me how it's choking." The room froze. Herr Vogel's smirk vanished, replaced by a mask of stunned disbelief. My grandfather let out a tiny, choked gasp. But Leo just gave a small, solemn nod, as if this was the only possible outcome. He took a deep breath and started walking toward the priceless broken heart of Mr. Finch's world. I watched him go, my own heart pounding in my chest. It felt like he was walking into a lion's den armed with nothing but a whisper. The other guests parted for him, creating a narrow aisle, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and contempt. They were expecting a failure, a final pathetic act in this tragic play. As Leo reached the table, he didn't immediately touch the watch. He just stood there for a moment, his small frame silhouetted against the glittering city skyline. Behind him, he closed his eyes and the entire room held its breath with him. He was no longer a maintenance man's grandson. He was the center of this universe of power and wealth, and he was about to either perform a miracle or be humiliated in front of them all. He reached out, his small, slightly grimy hand hovering over the gold and crystal masterpiece. Herr Vogel took an involuntary step forward, about to protest, but Mr. Finch shot him a look so cold it could have frozen fire. Vogel stopped dead in his tracks, his face turning a deep shade of red. Leo gently, almost reverently, picked up the watch. He didn't look at it through a magnifying glass or connect it to a machine. He simply held it in his cupped hands, brought it close to his right ear and closed his eyes again. The silence in the penthouse was absolute. All you could hear was the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. He stood there for a full minute, just listening, while the most powerful people in the room watched, utterly captivated by the quiet intensity of a 10-year-old boy. Finally, he opened his eyes and placed the watch back on its velvet cushion. He didn't look defeated. He looked certain. He turned to Mr. Finch, his expression serious. "I need two things," he said, his voice steady. "A pin, a simple sewing pin, and 1 drop of clock oil, the thin kind, for the escapement wheel." The request was so simple, so absurdly low-tech compared to Herr Vogel's arsenal of equipment, that a few people let out an incredulous scoff. A pin and oil to fix what a Swiss master couldn't. It was laughable. Herr Vogel actually did laugh this time, a short, barking sound of disbelief. "A pin?" he mocked. "The boy wants to fix a celestial complication with a pin? Alistair, this has gone far enough. This is an insult to my profession." But Mr. Finch didn't even look at Herr Vogel. His gaze remained locked on Leo, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was more like morbid curiosity, the kind a man has when he has absolutely nothing left to lose. He turned his head slightly toward his head of staff, a man standing rigidly by the wall. "Get the boy what he needs," Finch commanded, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. The order was so unexpected that the staff member hesitated for a second before scurrying off. Herr Vogel looked as if he'd been slapped. The billionaire had just chosen the word of a poor child over his world-renowned expertise. The power dynamic in the room had just cracked, and a deep, unsettling fissure was beginning to form right down the middle of the polished marble floor. My grandfather, seeing the staff member return with a small sewing kit, made one last desperate attempt to stop the inevitable. He grabbed my arm, his knuckles white. "Alex, do something," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and something I couldn't place. Was it pride? Tell them it's a game. Tell them he's just pretending. But he knew it wasn't a game. He had seen Leo do this 100 times with old broken clocks from the flea market. He knew the look in Leo's eyes. It was the same look his own father, the clockmaker, had when he was lost in the intricate dance of gears and springs. He was terrified of what would happen if Leo failed, but I think he was even more terrified of what it meant if he succeeded. Leo ignored the hushed drama around him. When the staff member presented the sewing kit, he calmly sorted through the pins until he found one that was thin but strong. Then he looked at the small vial of generic household oil the man was also holding and shook his head gently. "No, not that one," he said, his voice polite but firm. "That's too thick. It will gum up the pallet fork. I need 3-in-1, the light viscosity kind, for fine mechanisms." The specificity of the request stunned the room into a fresh silence. This wasn't a random guess. He knew about viscosity. He knew about pallet forks. Herr Vogel's face went from red to a pale, sickly white. The child wasn't just guessing. He was speaking the language of his craft, a language Vogel thought he had a monopoly on. A frantic search began for the specific oil. Finch's staff were running around, checking utility closets and storage rooms, but the penthouse was stocked with champagne and fine art, not workshop supplies. The tension was mounting with every passing second of failure. It seemed this last desperate hope would be thwarted by something as mundane as not having the right oil. Just as Mr. Finch was about to call it off, my grandfather cleared his throat. All eyes turned to him. He slowly reached into the deep pocket of his worn work jacket and pulled out a small, grimy glass vial with a faded handwritten label. My father. He used this, he said, his voice thick with emotion, for his finest work. He held it out, not to Mr. Finch, but directly to Leo. It was a passing of the torch. Herr Vogel saw his last chance. Slipping away and practically lunged forward. "Alistair, you cannot be serious," he pleaded, his voice now high-pitched with panic. "You are going to allow him to use an unknown contaminated substance on the Finch constellation? A single particle of dust from that vial could scratch the escapement jewels, the acidity from his skin, the humidity of his breath. This is sacrilege. You are destroying it." He was no longer the calm, condescending expert. He was a cornered animal, spitting and clawing to protect his territory, his reputation, which was now being threatened by a 10-year-old boy and a vial of old oil. But his frantic warnings only seemed to solidify Mr. Finch's resolve. The billionaire just gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Leo took the vial from our grandfather's hand and gave him a small, reassuring look. He didn't rush. He walked over to a small side table and asked for a clean handkerchief. He meticulously wiped his hands, then poured a single, perfect drop of the old oil onto the head of the pin. He held it up to the light, checking the consistency, his movements slow and deliberate. He wasn't playing. He was preparing for surgery. The guests, who had initially been smirking, were now completely silent, leaning forward in their seats. Their cruel amusement had transformed into a raw, intense fascination. They were witnessing something ancient and profound, a ritual that had nothing to do with money or status, and everything to do with pure, focused skill. With the oil balanced perfectly on the tip of the pin, Leo walked back to the velvet cushion. The entire penthouse seemed to shrink, focusing down to that single point of light on the watch face. He held the pin in one hand, and with the other, he gently steadied the watch casing, his touch so light it was barely there. The air was so thick with tension you could taste it. I could hear my own blood pounding in my ears. He lowered the pin, its tip heading not for the mainspring chamber that Vogel had obsessed over, but for a tiny, almost invisible decorative star on the watch's intricate face. He paused for a fraction of a second, his eye aligning with the pin, the star, and a universe of silent, waiting gears. Then, with a surgeon's steadiness, he touched the pin to the star. He didn't just touch it, he pressed. It was a firm, precise pressure applied to the very center of the star, a point no larger than a grain of sand. For a second, nothing happened. The world was still. Then, from the heart of the watch came a sound so faint it was more felt than heard, a tiny metallic tink. It wasn't the sound of life, not yet. It was the sound of something shifting, of a pressure being released. It was the sound of a lock, rusted shut for years, finally giving way. Herr Vogel leaned forward, his eyes narrowed, trying to dissect the sound, to prove it was nothing. But I saw Mr. Finch's hand, resting on the arm of his chair, twitch. He had heard it too. The choking breath had been let out. Leo didn't look up. He hadn't sought validation for that first small victory. He was still completely inside the watch's world. He carefully lifted the pin, wiped the oil from its tip on the handkerchief, and then returned to the watch face. This time he used the dry, sharp point to trace the intricate edges of the star, gently clearing a path that was invisible to everyone else. His movements were fluid and economical, born from hundreds of hours spent with tweezers and tiny screws in our grandfather's dusty workshop. He was a miniature artist, restoring a masterpiece, his brow furrowed in concentration. My grandfather stood beside me, his breath held, his earlier terror now replaced by a profound, disbelieving awe. He was watching a ghost of his own past, a skill he thought had died with his father, being reborn in his grandson's hands. Herr Vogel could not contain his professional outrage any longer. He broke the sacred silence, his voice a harsh, sibilant whisper aimed directly at Mr. Finch. He is dragging a crude steel pin across an enameled dial from 1784. Do you have any idea of the microscopic scratches he is creating? The heritage value he is destroying with every movement? This is not a repair. It is vandalism. Alistair, for the love of God, this has gone beyond a foolish indulgence. Stop him now before the Finch constellation is permanently scarred by this charade. He was pleading, but his plea was laced with the venom of a man whose entire identity was being dismantled by a child. He needed Leo to fail, not just to be right, but to restore order to his world. Mr. Finch did not flinch. He did not turn his head. He didn't even acknowledge Vogel's frantic, desperate words. His entire being was focused on Leo's small, steady hands. In response to Vogel's outburst, he slowly lifted his right hand and brought a single index finger to his lips. It was a simple, silent gesture, but in that room, it was an execution. It was the final definitive dismissal of the expert. It was an unconditional surrender to the unknown, a blind leap of faith driven not by hope, but by the complete absence of any other option. The power in the room had not just shifted, it had been completely redrawn. The billionaire had abdicated his throne of logic and reason, and now a 10-year-old boy in a worn-out sweater was the king. Having finished his delicate cleaning, Leo carefully placed the pin back on the handkerchief. He then did something that made no sense to anyone but my grandfather and me. He cupped his hands around the watch, without touching it, creating a small, enclosed space. He leaned in and breathed into it, a long, slow, gentle breath. It was a trick our other grandfather, the clockmaker, had sworn by. He called it waking the spirit of the machine, a way to gently raise the temperature of the cold, stiff metal and oil, preparing it for movement. To the wealthy spectators, it looked like some strange, primitive ritual, but I saw my grandfather's eyes glisten with tears. He wasn't just watching his grandson, he was seeing his own father, leaning over a workbench 50 years ago, breathing life into a broken timepiece. With the ritual complete, Leo picked up the watch. He held it flat in the palm of his hand. His fingers curled slightly to secure it. He looked down at it, not with the intense focus of a surgeon anymore, but with the gentle expectation of someone waiting for a friend to wake up. Then he began to move. It wasn't a shake or a jolt. It was a slow, deliberate, rhythmic rocking motion, a gentle side-to-side cradle, like lulling a baby to sleep. He was coaxing the gears, encouraging the newly oiled pivot and the freed escapement wheel to find each other, to remember their dance. The only sound in the vast, silent penthouse was the soft whisper of his sleeve against the air and the almost imperceptible weight of the gold watch shifting in his hand. The rocking continued for what felt like an eternity. 10 seconds, 20, 30, nothing. The watch face remained stubbornly still, a beautiful golden corpse. The magic, it seemed, had run out. I could feel the atmosphere in the room begin to curdle. The collective breath that had been held was starting to be released in sighs of disappointment. I saw Herr Vogel's lips begin to curl into a smug, triumphant sneer. He was right. It was all a fluke, a child's fantasy. My stomach dropped. I felt a hot flush of shame and fear for my little brother, who was about to be exposed as a fool in front of all these powerful, merciless people. The spell was broken. The guests began to stir, their brief fascination turning back into cold, cynical judgment. And then it happened. It wasn't loud, it wasn't a grand explosion of sound, it was the opposite. It was a sound so small, so perfect, that it seemed to absorb all the other noise in the universe. A single, crisp, clean click. It echoed in the dead silence of the penthouse, sharp and clear as a breaking icicle. For a heartbeat, the room was frozen, unsure of what it had just heard. Then, as one, every eye was drawn to the watch face. The long, slender second hand, which had been frozen at the 12 o'clock position for a week, trembled once. It trembled again. And then, with a smoothness that felt impossible, it began to sweep forward. 1 second, 2, 3. It was moving. The heart was beating. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. The sound of the ticking was the only thing that existed in that moment, a perfect rhythmic heartbeat in the cathedral of silence. Each sweep of the second hand was a hammer blow against Herr Vogel's reputation. He stood frozen, his face a grotesque mask of disbelief. His jaw was slack, his eyes wide with a horror that went beyond professional failure. It was the look of a man who had just seen a ghost, a man whose entire understanding of the world had been proven false by a 10-year-old boy. My grandfather's hand, which had been clutching my arm, fell limp to his side. He just stared, his mouth slightly open, as the impossible became real, tick by tock. The second hand completed its first full, elegant rotation. Then, with a quiet authority, the minute hand nudged forward. A moment later, one of the tiny celestial dials, the one tracking the moon's phase, began a slow, almost imperceptible crawl. The Finch constellation wasn't just ticking, it was waking up. Its intricate systems, dormant and locked in a protective stasis, were re-engaging one by one. The silent universe in its golden case was coming back to life. The faint, single tick was now layered with the whisper-soft whirring of dozens of gears, a complex mechanical symphony that only Leo had known was still waiting to be played. The silence in the room wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the sound of a perfectly restored soul. Herr Vogel, jolted into action by the watch's continued life, stumbled forward. He fumbled in his waistcoat pocket, pulling out a jeweler's loop and jammed it into his eye socket. He leaned over the table, his face inches from the watch, peering at it with a desperate intensity. He wasn't admiring the work. He was searching for a flaw, for an explanation that could salvage his shattered reality. "It's not possible," he muttered, his voice a hoarse, broken whisper that only I and a few others could hear. The mainspring, the structural integrity was compromised. It cannot. Why, ça? He was a high priest of science watching a miracle unfold, and it was breaking him. His logic, his instruments, his entire career, it had all been rendered meaningless by a pin and a drop of old oil. Mr. Finch rose from his chair, his movements slow and unsteady, as if he were decades older than he was. He walked toward the table, his expensive shoes making no sound on the thick rug. He didn't spare a glance for the crumbling expert beside him. His eyes were fixed on the living, breathing machine on the velvet cushion. He reached out a hand, not to touch the watch, but to simply hover his fingers above it, as if to feel the energy radiating from it. A single tear traced a path down his weathered, emotionless cheek. It wasn't a tear of joy or relief. It was a tear of profound, shattering awe. He was a king who had just witnessed a peasant perform an act of magic that all his gold could not buy. And Leo? He did nothing. He didn't look for praise or acknowledgement. He didn't puff out his chest or smile. After placing the watch back on the cushion, he simply wiped his hands on the handkerchief, folded it neatly, and placed it on the table beside the pin. His work was done. He turned away from the spectacle, his small shoulders relaxed, and walked back toward my grandfather and me. He looked up at me with his usual calm expression, as if he had just finished his homework or put away a toy. In the face of his own quiet miracle, his humility was more powerful than any boast. It was the calm certainty of a master who has no need for applause, because the work itself is the only reward he ever sought. The spell of silence finally broke, not with applause, but with a wave of hushed, incredulous murmurs. The guests, who had been poised for a cruel laugh, were now leaning forward, their faces a mixture of wonder and confusion. They were looking from the flawlessly ticking watch to the small boy who was now hiding behind his grandfather's legs, trying to become invisible again. Their world of price tags, brand names, and certified expertise had been turned upside down. They were witnessing something that didn't compute, a display of pure, innate talent that had no place in their ledgers or auction catalogues. A woman in a shimmering dress simply shook her head slowly, whispering, "My God," to the man beside her. They weren't just impressed, they were fundamentally shaken. I looked at my grandfather. The terror had vanished from his face, replaced by an expression I had never seen before. His back, usually stooped from a lifetime of service, was now ramrod straight. He looked down at Leo, and for the first time I saw no fear in his eyes, only a fierce, boundless pride that seemed to light him up from within. He placed his hand on Leo's shoulder, not to hold him back but to hold him up. Then he lifted his gaze and looked across the room, directly at Mr. Finch. The billionaire met his stare. In that single, silent exchange, a lifetime of unspoken hierarchy, the master in the penthouse, the servant in the basement, crumbled into nothing. It was a moment of pure human connection, an acknowledgement of a truth that was now ticking loud and clear for everyone to hear. Mr. Finch turned his gaze from the watch to Herr Vogel, who looked like a statue carved from salt. There was no anger in Finch's eyes, only a quiet, profound disappointment. "Herr Vogel," he said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of a final judgment. "Your invoice, For your diagnostic services will, of course, be paid in full, but I believe your work here is concluded. It was the most brutal firing I have ever witnessed, delivered not with a shout, but with a whisper. Vogel just nodded numbly, his face a pale, slack mask. He gathered his loop and, without a word to anyone, turned and walked toward the elevator. His shoulders slumped in a way that made his expensive suit look like a cheap rental. The room watched him go, and his exit felt like the final, definitive tick of the restored watch, marking the end of an era of arrogance. Then Mr. Finch turned to us. He walked over and knelt down, so his eyes were level with Leo's, the billionaire kneeling before the maintenance man's grandson. The image is burned into my memory. "What is your name, son?" he asked, his voice soft. "Leo," my brother replied, still a little shy. Mr. Finch smiled, a genuine, warm smile that transformed his stern face. "Leo," he repeated, "my father would have loved you. He always said the finest instruments aren't made of gold and jewels, but of patience and understanding." He then looked at my grandfather, his eyes filled with a new kind of respect. "Your grandson has a gift, a rare gift that my money could never buy. I would be honored if you would allow me to foster it. I have a workshop full of broken, beautiful things. They are waiting for someone who can listen to them." My grandfather, who had spent his life being invisible in this building, stood, taller than I'd ever seen him. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet dignity. He placed a hand on Leo's head and nodded slowly at Mr. Finch. "The boy, he has his great-grandfather's hands," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It would be an honor, sir." In that moment, it wasn't an employee agreeing with his boss. It was two men from two different worlds, making a pact over the future of a child who had just reminded them both of what truly matters. It wasn't about a job or money. It was about legacy, the kind that isn't inherited but is earned through talent and humility. The guests watched, their cynical whispers replaced by a respectful, awed silence. They were witnessing a transfer of power more significant than any business deal. Mr. Finch then stood and faced his guests. He picked up the watch, its ticking now a steady, confident rhythm in the quiet room. "Tonight," he began, his voice resonating with a newfound humility, "I had intended to show you an object of immense value. Instead, I believe we have all been shown what real value is." He paused, looking around at the sea of wealthy, powerful faces. "We were reminded that the most complex problems are often solved not by the loudest voices or the most expensive tools, but by the one who has the patience to simply listen to what is broken." He held up the watch, a testament to his words. "This is not just the Finch constellation anymore. From this day forward, it will be known as the Leo constellation. A reminder that genius can be found anywhere, and true expertise has nothing to do with a price tag." That night changed everything. Leo was given his own key to Mr. Finch's private workshop, a mechanical wonderland filled with clocks, automatons, and music boxes that had been silent for decades. He spent his weekends there, not as an employee, but as an apprentice and a friend to the old billionaire. He wasn't just fixing things, he was learning their histories, their secrets. Our grandfather started bringing him, and you could see the years of servitude fall away from him as he watched Leo work, his own forgotten knowledge of clockmaking coming back to him. Our family's life wasn't suddenly filled with luxury, but it was filled with something far more valuable, purpose and pride. My little brother, the quiet boy who listened to broken things, had given our family its soul back. He had fixed more than just a watch that night. Years later, the story of that night has become a quiet legend among collectors. Herr Vogel disappeared from the high-end horology scene, his reputation shattered not by a rival, but by the simple, undeniable truth of a child's intuition. As for me, I learned the most important lesson of all. I saw firsthand that the world is full of people who will judge you by your clothes, your age, or where you come from. They will try to make you feel small, invisible, and worthless, but they don't get to decide your value. True strength isn't about shouting to be heard. It's about knowing your own truth so deeply that you can make the world stop and listen, even if all you have is a whisper, a pin, and the courage to try when everyone else has given up. After Mr. Finch's speech, the atmosphere in the penthouse was completely different. The cold, judgmental air had been replaced by a quiet, almost reverent warmth. No one rushed to leave. Instead, the guests, these powerful men and women, seemed to linger, watching my brother, who was now shyly explaining to Mr. Finch how he knew the decorative star was actually a functional pivot. They weren't looking at him as a curiosity anymore. They were looking at him with genuine respect. They had come to witness the unveiling of a priceless object, but they left having witnessed an invaluable moment. The ticking of the watch was no longer just a sound. It was the new heartbeat of that room, a rhythm that had reset everyone's understanding of what true worth looked like. It was a lesson, delivered in golden gears, and it was unforgettable. That night wasn't just a victory for Leo. It was a liberation for our entire family. My grandfather, who had spent 40 years walking through that building with his head down, now walked with a newfound pride. He became a fixture in Finch's workshop alongside Leo, not as a maintenance man, but as a respected consultant, a bridge to a forgotten generation of craftsmen. Leo thrived, his gift nurtured in a world that finally saw him for who he was. And me? I stopped seeing the world as a place of rigid hierarchies. I learned that the uniforms people wear, whether it's a billionaire's suit or a janitor's overalls, are just costumes. The real person is underneath, and sometimes the most brilliant minds are hidden in the most unexpected places, just waiting for someone desperate enough or wise enough to give them a chance to be seen. The lesson of the Leo constellation became a quiet legend, not just for its miraculous repair, but for what it represented. It's a story about how we so often mistake credentials for competence and confidence for knowledge. We're taught to trust the experts with their expensive tools and complicated jargon, and to dismiss the quiet observers, the ones who listen instead of proclaim. But true genius often doesn't announce itself. It works in silence. It finds solutions in simplicity. It understands that before you can fix something, you have to have the patience and the humility to truly understand why it's broken. Herr Vogel tried to impose his will on the watch. Leo simply listened to what it needed. That was the difference. That was everything. I think about that night all the time. I remember the weight of the silence, the smug look on Vogel's face, and the terror in my grandfather's eyes. But most of all, I remember the look on Leo's face when he held that watch. It wasn't arrogance. It was a quiet, profound connection. He wasn't just fixing a machine, he was communicating with it. Watching him taught me that our greatest strengths often lie in the very things people dismiss about us. For Leo, it was his quietness, his tendency to listen more than he spoke. In a world that rewards the loudest voice, he showed me that the most powerful thing you can do is trust your own quiet intuition, even when no one else on earth believes in you. His victory wasn't just for him, it was for every person who has ever been told they were not enough. If this story resonated with you, or if you know someone who feels overlooked and needs to be reminded of their own hidden strength, please consider sharing this with them. Sometimes, just hearing that it's possible is all the encouragement someone needs. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding your own path and proving that true value comes from within, not from the approval of others. Thank you for listening and for being a part of this community. Your presence here means more than you know.